Hello ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to my reaction channel. My name is Teddy90 and today we're going to be reacting to What If the Soviet Union Never Existed by What If Alt Hist. Now What If Alt Hist is a great YouTube channel. It's great for any alternate history fans out there. I personally very much do love them. I'm not currently subscribed on this particular channel because I have another one, but I'll sub to them right now. They make a lot of great content, like what if England won the 100 Years War and other things like that. They're very similar to Alternate History Hub in that way. But Alternate History Hub has a tendency to pull back from giving any definitive answers of what could potentially happen, which is fair. While What If Alt Hist goes right down the rabbit hole and just kind of was like, this might have happened, but, you know, who knows. So, different styles, both great channels. Give this video a like. The What If Alt Hist video, obviously not me. If you enjoy their content, go subscribe to them if you enjoy their content, everything else like that. Let's just jump into this. This is currently the first day of quarantine. Well, not really quarantine, but kind of self-quarantine for me, I suppose. So I figured the Corona bottle would be applicable. Laid off from work. All my university classes are now online. We'll see how that turns out. So I have a lot of free time. Yeah, let's just jump into this.
The Soviet Union was once very important. It was once one of the greatest powers on Earth, and possibly history, with the power of life and death over billions, and controlling a stretch of...
I believe the Soviet Union fell 94? The year before I was born? Soviet Union... No, 91. I'm dumb, yeah. Don't ask questions.
Elba to the Bering Strait. It was a state that killed 20 million of its own citizens, and the largest slave system in history, while also industrializing much of Russia. None of this almost came to be. If a few battles had gone differently in the Russian Civil War, the Soviet Union would never have...
Now, I'm going to admit a massive amount of ignorance here. I know very, 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 very little of Russian history and Russian battles and the Russian Civil War. I know very little. I know a great deal about a lot of other histories. If you watch this channel, you know that. But I know very little about the Russian Revolution or anything about it. Like I kind of know the main players type of deal. It just never really came up in my interest of study. So for this particular one, this is going to be more of a react and talking about it rather than my typical commentary. Just so you're aware.
Existed afterwards. So it begs the question. What if the Soviet Union never existed? What would happen if instead the monarchists had won the Russian Civil War? That is the question of this alternate history. Before World War I, the communists were a tiny part of Russia's population, probably somewhere around 5%. What allowed the communists to seize power over the entire country was they did the right things in the right place at the right time. Lenin, the communist leader, was able to exploit the disaffection and anti-war feeling caused by the Russians getting their ass whipped by the Germans in the First World War so badly, and thus catapult himself into power. Lenin was a remarkably charismatic figure, at least in public, and so if we can get rid of him, the central glue that held the revolution together would fall apart. In this timeline, Lenin is shot at the Battle of Svivayazisk on the Volga River in 1918.
That is something I would never be able to pronounce, and I'm surprised he was able to pronounce it as well as he could. Let's go back and listen to that, shall we?
To get rid of him, the central glue that held the revolution together would fall apart. In this timeline, Lenin is shot at the Battle of Svivayazisk on the Volga.
Yeah, there's not a chance in the 9 hells that I'd be able to get that right.
Volga River in 1918. Well, he was...
Alright, yeah, the whole touching of the face thing, eh? Just caught myself doing it. Yeah, that's going to be happening all the time. Also, ignore the mild cough I have. I might have it, who knows.
Marching along the battle lines to inspire the troops.
Maybe.
In our timeline, the communists were losing at this stage of the war, but Lenin was able to rally them in the Volga and create a stable front line. Lenin had a quasi-religious cult following, and thus with his death, especially while he was trying to rally the troops, would deal a horrifying blow to the communist cause. The Volga front would break with the white Siberian and Ukrainian armies meeting up, driving the communists.
You don't fuck with Finland. Poland, still free. Temporarily. Poland's history at least modern history, is that of always getting conquered and always getting fucked with. It had an empire for 200, 300 years, lost it, and continued
Without
getting
Lenin's
fucked by
central
everyone.
leadership, the communist cause loses cohesion, and the communist armies start to falter, lose battles, and then morale, and then men. Remember, the armies of the Russian Civil War were well-armed mobs more than anything else, so if morale was collapsing, so would the sizes of the armies, as men would defect from the red to white armies. After a few years of bloody fighting, the whites would converge in the center of Russia and
Used to be German, but given to the whites.
crush the rest of the communists. This would be followed by a purge of the communists throughout Russia, killing thousands. Russia would likely become a constitutional democratic monarchy in this world. The whites had all sorts of political platforms, but most of them wanted a constitutional democratic monarchy run by a relative of the Habsburgs. The extent of which is power is difficult to guess, since there are many different factions involved, so it could have been anything from the Kaiser's Germany, where the Kaiser held most real power but gave some internal decisions to the Reichstag, to the Queen's relationship with Canada today with a purely ceremonial role.
It probably would have maneuvered towards the Queen's ceremonial role. Who knows what if it would have been authoritarian, but even authoritarian governments eventually shift towards letting the people have more say, because it's just generally easier to run the country that way. Having an autocratic one person ruling it is a great way to ferment rebellions and things like that. So it is just fundamentally easier to shift towards this and keep your royal title.
This Russian state would likely have borders similar to our timeline's USSR. An exception would be Poland, which would be large enough to maintain independence, and the Russians would be too disorganized to reconquer it. I'm guessing Russia reconquers the Baltics with them being so small, and a big reason they stayed independent was that the West supported them so the communists wouldn't conquer them. A large part of the white Russian elite as well was from this region. A question I spend a lot of time thinking about is how much effort is needed to break a civilization. It's because time and time again in history...
This is one of those important, immeasurable questions in history that you can't prove, but nonetheless are quite important. Some of the others are, how does climate or culture affect fighting ability? That's a great one. How does child-rearing affect history? Another good one. Does decadence exist, and if so, what are its effects? Believing in the importance of any of these is entirely reasonable from historical record, but they're all impossible to measure. Very true. To a certain extent, I agree with I have opinions on all of these. Let's start with child rearing. Obviously, nations that take care of their children better have a tendency to have more cohesive family units that then lead to more cohesive cultures. Like if you look at Japan, China, places like that, specifically East Asian infected by Confucianism and Taoism. If you look at their way, their familial... India as well, I suppose. If you look at their culture and how it... Like, the parents take care of the children, and then the children end up taking care of the parents, and then the grandchildren end up taking care of their parents, and then the parents' parents, and it's like this cohesive, all in the family, like, united as, like, one familial structure. They all take care of each other. They're all interlocked. The family lives together. Like, it's not uncommon for families to have like big familial houses, everyone living in the exact same building. Like that is perfectly common in the East. That is just something that happens in the East. In the West, you turn 18, get fucked, get out of my house. So it develops this, and that was happening. Well, the Germanic tribes for a while didn't have that. They had a bit more of an independent streak, and I know the Romans, from what I understand, had a bit more of a familial tie. Same with the Middle Ages, but especially in the Renaissance and the Enlightenment, it became the idea of, oh, there's too many children on this farm, some of these children just have to get off, or if you're a noble family, like, there's only one heir, right? The heir and the spare. So the spare has to get fucked and he has to leave. Or, like, they'll get a random piece of land. Like, they don't stay together. Like, the idea is there's the heir and then there's the spare, and get rid of the spare, just move him away. Well, in East Asia, there was things like that. Obviously, the heir and the spare and interfamily fighting, but they had a more cohesive unit. So it ended up shifting cultures, while the West went a lot more individualistic, because they didn't have that cohesive family structure. The East had that cohesive family structure. So you see a very interlocked society in the East. Whether or not that's good or bad is entirely up to you, but that does have an effect. Now, I've rambled on for a bit too long, I have a feeling, so I'm going to let this go. But if you guys are curious about this, just honestly look at Indonesia or the Philippines and how they fought versus how China or Japan or anybody with a more temperate climate fought. Even India and India's interior, like the northern India or India's interior, the difference of how they fought each other. Of course, that has a massive, especially climate. Climate has a massive way of how to fight. Like in Indonesia, like guns barely worked because it was so humid. Like, climate has a massive effect on how people fought. Culture as well, depending on. Again, I could go for hours onto this. And then, does decadence exist? Decadence definitely exists, and we're definitely in a decadent age. Whether or not decadence is bad is up to you. But decadence does exist. Like, our current commercial structure, where all we do is consume throughout, consume throughout, consume throughout, consume throughout, consume throughout, consume throughout, right? Like we're a very decadent society, but we're also the most advanced. We have so many more technology. Like, life is so much better, but we are incredibly decadent. But is that a bad thing? In history, generally it was seen as a bad thing, but because decadent societies would then get conquered by less decadent. But now we're in an era where that doesn't happen, right? Like, there's no way for our society to get conquered by someone else. Our society can still fall, and this coronavirus might do it, but decadence isn't necessarily a bad thing. Decadence is a sign of your empire has gotten so stable and so well that people can enjoy the frivolities of empire, which realistically that's what most nations kind of are now in comparison to history. Most nations now are kind of imperialist, which is how we're treating each other. Like, countries that are up and coming and things like that back in history had a tendency to struggle, had a tendency to fight. We're now all in, even though we don't, well, some countries do have economic empires, but even though we don't technically have empires now, we are enjoying the fruits of what would then be, or what was in the past considered an imperialist system, which is we're enjoying the fruits of the, it's hard to explain, but like in imperialist Rome, like the upper class and the middle class could enjoy a great deal of wealth, could go to the arenas and things like that, and like enjoy life, could do random art projects and things like things were better in that imperialist system. We have the exact same things in our system, but it's not technically imperialist, but we do still technically have imperial decadence. It just is now under a different name, since we don't have real imperialism, even though most countries do economic imperialism, unless you happen to live in a particularly poor country. A lot of African countries and a lot of South American countries fall into that list. Okay, I went really off topic. We're only 3 minutes into this video, or 3 minutes into the watch video of this, and 13 minutes into that of my own video, so I'm just gonna shut the fuck up.
You see some horrifying event that breaks the will of a society.
Sorry.
The society might linger on for some
gonna
time,
drink
but the
beer.
population stops.
People tend to think declining populations are a purely modern issue, but they've actually been happening quite a bit throughout history. Very true. Whether in Imperial Rome, yep, late ancient Greece, or in the 17th century Europe, normally the population goes up when a new religion develops or economic opportunities improve. Yes, I could go into discussion about this. Looking at the time disparity, I'm not gonna.
Beautiful art stops being made. The society stops geographically expanding outwards. Government becomes more at dividing the present and preparing for the future. We saw it with European civilization with the World Wars, Greek with the Peloponnesian Wars, medieval civilization with the Black Death, and you could even make the argument that the...
I'm not making this argument out of bigotry. It actually has merit. Islam was at the cutting edge of technology in the early Middle Ages, very true. But in the argument of whether God was inherently rational or irrational, the West chose the first and Islam the second. thus resulting in very different technological tracks. An argument has been made. The primary reason chose the second argument was that the Mongol conquest of the Middle East so horrifying that there was no way that a rational God could have allowed it. Thus, with an irrational God, the best way to understand the world was to read the Quran, and science was useless since God could just change the rules at will. I've never heard that particular theory. I really never have heard that theory. The main theory I've heard about why Islam is now a wreck, let's be real, Islam is right now a wreck, is because well, obviously the Mongols definitely didn't help. Anywhere the Mongols the theory I heard was that anywhere the Mongols conquered turned super conservative because they wanted to protect their culture. They wanted to like protect and militarize and isolate themselves. So it directly went towards a more conservative culture. If you look at I know China's technically communist, whatever the fuck that means these days, but they're not. So if you look at Russia, which got conquered by the Mongols, if you look at a lot of Middle Eastern countries, China, if you look at, what's correct? If you look at Korea, I suppose they're kind of conservative. But a lot of countries that were devastatingly affected by the Mongols had a more conservative bent. Like if you look at the Ming Dynasty, the dynasty that rose after the Yuan Dynasty, which was the Mongol dynasty. The Yuans were the Mongols. Yuans? I don't know how to pronounce it. Yuans. If you look at the Ming, they were very isolationist. They wanted to protect their culture. They wanted to protect themselves. They finished the fucking wall, the Great Wall. Like, they became very isolationist. So that is an argument I heard. I've never heard the rational versus irrational God. Another theory I heard about Islam, why it is now currently a wreck, is because there was a budding Islamic Renaissance. That's not the right word. Reformation almost during the mid 15th to 16th centuries. But then the Ottomans, the Autoturks, decided that they wanted to go much more rigid, much more structured, much more obey the caliph, shut the fuck up, don't question us. So that doubled down on the natural conservatism of A, religion in general, B, the Mongol invasion and the general fuckery that caused, and C, and C, the general conservative nature of Quran itself, right? The Quran is more a pretty conservative religious text, just in comparison to many others. Not that the Bible isn't either or anything else like that, but it is a fairly conservative religious text. So that just compounded, and the fact that they were forced to obey the caliph and they couldn't have any other thoughts during the time that like a reformation was almost kind of breaking out, really stifled Islam. And now we're seeing the issue of an Islam without a real caliph. I think, do the Saudis claim the caliph? Because if so, they're doing a terrible job at it. Again, I don't know much about this, but they don't really have a real caliph. The Middle East, throughout the vast majority of its history, has been united. Right now, it's disunited. So right now, we're seeing what you would see in like the warring states period in China, right? Or the warring, or Europe, right? Like the Middle East is used to being unified. Right now, it's not unified. It needs to get unified again. That's the only way the Middle East can really function. Because it's been unified throughout most of its history. It's not good at being disunified because it's been unified for longer. Now, there are people who say, oh, but the individual cultures deserve the right to rule themselves. And they do. But from a stability point, from a historical point, A, the borders that are currently existing don't matter. Like, they're stupid. The borders that are in the Middle East right now are stupid. And the Middle East is... It doesn't understand how not to be unified. It's been unified for too long that being like, oh, now you can govern yourselves. Of course, cultural, religious, and historical rivalries are going to flash up and burn everything to the ground. Of course that's going to happen. That would happen anywhere. If China tomorrow, or India is probably a better example. India is surprisingly unified, even though throughout most of its history it never was. If India fell apart tomorrow, we'd be seeing the exact same shit that's happening in the Middle East in India. We just would. Because cultural and religious differences would flare the fuck up. And India's an incredibly diverse country. They have, what, hundreds of languages or something insane like that? Yeah, in India should have been the next Balkans. Or should have been the Balkans, because the Balkans were a shit show during the... Well, were generally a shit show. Well, that's also a good example. The Balkan... Like, after Yugoslavia fell apart, the Balkans were in a state of war for a long time. It's only recently that they stopped because of foreign intervention pretty much forced them to. So yeah, the Middle East makes sense, and India would do the exact same thing because of all the different... Anywhere would do the exact same thing. Anyway, I'm just gonna shut the fuck up.
Mongols have messed up Islam for 700 years. In each of these situations, so many people died that people stopped believing in the future. This is what communism has done to Russia. Stalin and the horrifying tribulations he's put his country through has resulted in a Russia that stopped believing in the future. Russia today is at oligarchs trying to steal as much from the country as possible and put it into Cypriot, British, or French bank accounts. In fact, more Russian money is outside of Russia in bank accounts than inside it. Putin's regime is...
Russia's a shit show. It's a paper tiger. Everyone's scared of Russia. But if you push Russia in any fucking sense, it's gonna collapse economically like a fucking paper tiger. It's not strong at all. It's flexing its muscles, trying to be like, oh, we're so strong, we have a big military. But if you put any economic... If the world decided to put the economic screws on Russia, they break.
Morally corrupt.
They break
with no
very
principles
fast.
Except dominance and power. Russia has some of the lowest birth rates on Earth and stagnant economic growth. The sad thing was that this wasn't always the case. Russia before the First World War showed enormous promise. Academia has been dominated by pro-communist left...
Breakdown of political leanings of Yale professors. Not many conservatives, some moderates, somewhat liberal, and very liberal. Yeah, it is true. The more university education you get, or just not university, but the more education you get, the more left-leaning you become, which is weird. I'm not going to talk about this.
The last 60 years,
I've been talking too much.
The Tsar's Russia has consistently been vilified or down...
I do have opinions on that, and I'll get to them at some other video.
But this isn't really an accurate picture. It was experiencing enormous economic, industrial, and demographic growth. Russia was an enormous food...
Oh, and in the comments, guess where I happen to lean politically. I'm curious what you guys think.
...exporter of the fields of Ukraine, supporting European cities. Russia was producing some of the top intellectuals and artists in practically every field. In fact, one of the most important reasons for the First World War was that Germany had calculated, incorrectly it turns out, that they could no longer beat Russia after 1916 due to its growing strength, and they might as well strike Russia where they could still win. Russia was geopolitically the China of the early 20th century. The way the communists destroyed this promising Russia is one of the great tragedies of the modern era. I think a primary reason was the destruction of the kulaks. The Stolypin reforms of 1905 gave the peasants their own land, and thus differing classes of peasants developed. What Stalin did was kill off the wealthiest and most successful peasants, people who Stalin worried would become a new source of authority beside
If you kill all the smart people, you have a nation of the dumb.
him. This had the effect of killing off the most hardworking and industrious.
If you kill off the people who know what the fuck they're doing, because let's be real, most people don't know what the fuck they're doing. If you kill off the people who know what the fuck they're doing, your society is gonna collapse.
Which had dire effects in the economy and Russian society. Production declined drastically as famine gripped the Soviet Union, and a lesson was taught to the Russian people, that working hard will only cause you more pain.
Yep.
Another interesting effect of Soviet rule on Russia was the collapse in birth rate. Russia during the Tsars had one of the highest birth rates on Earth, with around 7 children per woman. By the end of the Soviet era, the average Soviet woman had 1.5 children, beneath replacement levels. The Soviet Union just made a hopeless society in which people wondered if there'd be any future for their children, and also I've heard that Soviet hospitals were so deeply unpleasant that many women didn't want to get pregnant just so they wouldn't have to enter them. This is why Russia has, for all intents and purposes, the same population as World War II, while the US's has more than doubled since then, and...
Wow, look at Iraq's population. That is a massive growth rate. Same with Vietnam. I'm surprised Vietnam's doing so well. I'm surprised Iraq's doing
Most
so well.
developing countries have anywhere from 3 to 9 times the population.
Mm-hmm.
Russia in this timeline would have upwards of twice the population and 9 times.
Can you really consider Somalia as a country? Also, Somaliland's its own thing at this point. Let's be real. Somaliland and Somalia are two very different things. Somaliland has functioning cities and a functioning government. Somalia is, and I think their cutoff point is here. I know they're technically not recognized, but I recognize them for what it's worth. Because they're functioning. They're a functioning society in comparison to whatever the hell is happening in Somalia.
Russia in this timeline would have upwards of twice the population, likely nearing 400 million.
I'm getting... I missed this. If Russia proper had America's rate of growth, it would have a population of 264 instead of 146.
Russia in this timeline would have upwards of twice the population.
I'm getting the 400 million number since you would expect Russia, a less developed country than the U.S., to maintain a higher birth rate for or longer. And also, as we will see later, the Russian Empire would probably not fall. I can spoil my own channel.
Likely nearing 400 million people. These people would in large part migrate into the east, into Siberia and Central Asia. Siberia has the reputation for being an uninhabitable wasteland.
True.
This is only partly true. Large sections of its southern reaches have a moderately temperate climate, at least by my Canadian standards. But there just aren't enough Russians to settle them in our world. In this timeline, we would see ethnic Russians settling in Siberia, expanding the Russian population enormously and founding new cities. Russians would become the ethnic majority in much of Central Asia, surpassing the native population in many regions. A comparison could be made to the enormous migration of Americans from the Rust Belt to the southern and western United States after World War II, making California and Texas more important states than Ohio and New York. The Soviets also killed off many of Russia's intellectuals. This is why Soviet art of all stripes sucks. If you were an intellectual, you would follow Stalin's wildly fluctuating dictates to the word, and if not...
Did anyone play the game Mao as a child? No. The rules are, you get a group of children, one is appointed dictator and makes arbitrary rules like, don't raise your hand but tells no one. Anyone who breaks the arbitrary rule loses. If you figure out the rule, you win. This is a children's game in America, and it was an adult's game in totalitarian regimes. Never heard of that, actually.
To the Gulag.
That's fun,
this killed
though.
Russia's pre-existing large cultural influence. Soviet technology was held back by Stalin's bizarre...
Yeah, instead of losing, you just get shot.
...predilections. For example, in biology, Stalin picked a bizarre theory put out by one of his favorites, and anyone...
The theory was that basically natural selection doesn't exist, and that an animal's actions throughout its life affects its genes and how its offspring grow up. Thus, Darwinism effectively became illegal in the Soviet Union. This thinking resulted in bizarre effects such as attempting to build an army of apes.
Who stood against it was considered a Western hack and sent to the Gulag. Soviet science was only able to flourish in incredibly abstract fields like physics. This would be different in this timeline, with Russia a much more powerful technological juggernaut. Also, my friend the Aral Sea needs a shout-out here. The Aral Sea was a large inland sea in Central Asia that the Soviet Union destroyed in their desire to turn Central Asia into Russia's cotton belt.
Oh. I never knew they destroyed
This
a
worked,
sea.
they prevented any water from getting into the sea and thus drained it and destroyed the local ecosystem. As America's idiotic water policy in the West demonstrates,
Why the fuck are we growing cotton into
capitalist
Arizona?
regimes can do equally stupid things. However, only communism's single-minded hatred of nature...
Some quotes from our buddy Mao Zedong. Make the high mountain bow its head, make the river yield its way. Man's ability to know and change nature is unlimited. Man must conquer nature.
allowed this
Thus
to
Beijing
happen.
looks like this.
Democracies with the public's emotions important and monarchies with their respect for
Just said, you know, we're gonna get rid of Lake Michigan, and then the imagining shit show
tradition
would follow.
would have applied brakes at some point to keep most of the Aral Sea intact. The Soviets get a lot of credit for industrializing Russia and quickly finishing the process the Tsars started. Like all communist states, the Soviets had a very strong focus on industrialization. However, the Soviet Union was able to industrialize by destroying everything else. They didn't build a natural and stable industrial economy. Instead, in a mad rush for heavy industry, destroyed the entire society and economy. The quality of the goods involved was terrible, without any external judge or competition besides the state.
Stable industrial economies need demand for the goods produced. This is normally achieved by expanding the agricultural productivity, which frees up workers for factories, creates extra food for growing cities, and makes the farmers wealthier and thus able to buy the things that the cities produce. B, selling to wealthier foreign nations goods that are produced cheaply with the cheap labor, and the value of the goods produced nurtures the poorer nations. The China East Asia method. The Soviets instead starved the peasant population, took their produce to feed the cities, and then the starving peasants were forced into the cities to work in the factories.
And the demand was weak with a poor agricultural base to pull from. So, did the Soviets do anything good? A couple things, actually. Firstly, although this has been really overstated by the left, it was moderately better for women. Also, Russia before the Red seized power is moving in a...
True, I know many people on the left that... how to put this... That seem to idolize the Soviet Union and Cuba and places like that because, like, oh, they're better for women and other things like that. And it's like, no. Well, yeah, but no. But yeah, but no. Yeah, try to guess my political leanings. You won't get it.
Very nationalistic direction, with the regime being taken over by Slavic nationalists. In this timeline, Russia, even if still a democracy, would be taken over by a deeply racist and nationalistic regime that would marginalize, especially the Turkic peoples of Central Asia.
Sorry,
Russia, even if regime being taken over by Slavic nationalists, very national better for women. Also, Russia before the Red seized power is moving in a very nationalistic direction, with the regime being taken over by Slavic nationalists. In this timeline, Russia...
Yeah, pan-Slavism, right?
Even if still a democracy, would be taken over by a deeply racist and nationalistic regime that would marginalize, especially the Turkic peoples of Central Asia. Peoples like the Kazakhs, Uzbeks, and the like would be driven onto reservations while the best lands would be given to Slavs. Another really bad thing was that Tsarist Russia was very anti-Semitic, with pogroms picking up in its final years. This would get much worse as the Jews were a large proponent.
The Jews have always been strong proponents in various left-wing social redistributive movements, whether with the communism, socialism, feminism, or just left-wing parties. That makes sense because they've always been persecuted. So having conservative ideology makes no sense for them because the people who hate them are the conservatives. This has always puzzled me since the Jews have done quite well in capitalist society. Do any of my Jewish fans have answers about what Jewish culture gravitates towards these causes? Is it a century of oppression? Is it a greater level of cooperation in the cooperation side of the Jewish community? I don't know.
Of the communist cause, and having the communists being so bloodthirsty during the Civil War.
Well, you can be left-wing in the capitalist society, right? Socialism and feminism can fit into capitalism. I'm not Jewish, but because of the vast amount of persecution that they have, and because everyone else is racist, homophobic, and everything else like that towards them, of course they would go in the opposite direction, because why the fuck would you have similar beliefs as the people persecuting you?
War would just inflame the anti-Semitism of the Russian nationalists. After the war, in an attempt to purify the Slavic nation, Russia would evict all its Jews. This was pretty bad time for immigration, as Europe was deeply shell-shocked after the First World War and wasn't accepting immigrants, especially from disliked ethnic minorities. The U.S. also closed its borders to immigration in 1921. Some would migrate to the Levant, but the British colonial overlords wouldn't allow more than would disturb the balance of power between Arabs and Jews, and thus make their job more difficult. The main countries that were accepting immigrants at this point were in South America, and so millions of Jews would migrate to Argentina and Brazil. With their mercantile skill set, the Jews would enrich the whole region, as has been the case with every country that has seen mass Jewish immigration. Rio de Janeiro and Buenos Aires would become significantly wealthier and culturally more active in this timeline. In summary, you would see a very different Russia develop. It would be a strong capitalist economy with a burgeoning population, albeit a quite racist and xenophobic
asses of the comment, when can
society.
I move?
With a colonial constitutional monarchy, Russia would fit in with the civilized states of the 1920s.
Civilized states. Conquering 5 primitive states is necessary for membership. True. Very true.
Well. Instead of becoming a pariah state, Russia would remain a part of the world's community. Russia would trade ideas and goods with the West, with Russian grain supporting much of Europe. Germany's greatest fear has always been being overrun by Slavic hordes from the East. It was bad enough when they were both Christian, but when the Slavic hordes became part of an ideology that literally espoused the destruction of Western civilization and private property, it just made the danger that much worse.
Sure.
The Nazi idea of an enormous international Judeo-Marxist conspiracy was given credence by there actually being an international communist conspiracy to destroy the Germany they knew. With a much more reasonable threat, this timeline's version of the Nazis would be much more reasonable. There would still likely be a fascist movement in Germany due to the defeat in World War I, but would likely be more along the lines of Franco or Mussolini's movements, not advocating genocide or the like, merely wanting a return of Germany's honor and empire. World War II would likely still happen, with the seeds for it planted in the First World War, and with long-term geographic reasons also sparking it. The war would likely still follow a similar outline, with Germany getting involved in a two-front war with Russia and the Western powers due to Germany's geographic position. Russia would still likely win the war. Russia might be slightly less industrialized, so it would have other advantages that work in its favor that would balance it out. Stalin killed 80% of the high-level Russian officers in 1938, and thus Russian leadership in the early stages of the war was abysmal. Soviet military doctrine, due to Stalin's obsession with control, was quite inefficient and hierarchical, and thus resulting in unnecessary loss and waste. The Soviets were so awful to the Ukrainians that many actually supported the Germans in the early stages of the war as well. It's impossible to know the exact details of this war, when Russia would get involved, when it would end, but a similar rough outline to our timeline seems reasonable. We would likely end up seeing Russia and the US divide up the European continent. The Russians would support conservative monarchies in each country, placing a relative of the Kaiser in charge of East Germany and similar regimes in Poland, Hungary, and the like. During the fall of the Japanese Empire in 1945, we would likely still see the Russians attack Manchuria and give it to an allied power. In this timeline, there would be a monarchist faction rather than the communists. This could end in several different ways. Firstly, we could see China divided between a monarchist north and a nationalist south, or with the nationalists taking over the whole thing. There wasn't a strong monarchist movement among the majority Han Chinese, since the last monarchs were the barbarian foreign Manchus, and so it seems unlikely that the monarchists would take over the Han heartland of China. However, it is possible that the American-supported nationalists would have crushed the Russian-supported monarchists and united China. In either way, China would be in much better shape. I once read a book that said that Mao, by grace of dying, was the most important thing in the history of reducing poverty. China, after changing to a capitalist system, was able to become a world economy and power. With the nationalists or monarchists in charge, this would have happened decades earlier.
Communism, great idea on paper. Terrible in practice.
Similarly, without Russian support, countless other communist regimes around the world would have never come to be. African warlords in need of weapons would have appealed to whatever cause the Russians or Americans would want. Latin Americans wanting to distance themselves.
Seems likely that Latin American rebels would fall back on racial connotations, saying the white landowners and Americans were scheming to keep down the native or mixed-race peasants. The revolutions would reclaim the false pre-Spanish conquest of the utopia of the native peoples.
The United States and their ruling landlords.
There was never a utopia. I've talked to many people who seem to have this utopic view of tribal states, which isn't true at all. Tribal states were so much worse than a lot of farming states, even though a lot of farming states ended up destroying a lot of things. Like our history has a lot of terrible things in it, because we ended up industrializing and because we ended up developing agriculture and all that other stuff. But if we would have stayed tribal gatherer, which I've met some people who believe that might have been a better option, we wouldn't have advanced at all. We wouldn't have had all of this. We wouldn't have had electricity. We wouldn't have the internet. We wouldn't have me talking to a camera like that. It was necessary.
It would appeal to ethnic nationalism rather than communism. Truth be told, communism was the best thing that ever happened to the U.S. It retarded or destroyed the development of the countries that would be its greatest natural competitors due to their size, Russia and China. Without the inefficiencies of communism, it seems likely that the Eastern Bloc would have collapsed. With all the resources and space combined with enormous cultural and soft power, Russia would be very dangerous indeed. In fact, considering the resource-to-population ratio, if the Russian system was even halfway honest, they would be one of the richest countries on Earth. That would be quite an attractive alternative to the United States. Meanwhile, China, with a 30-year head start, would be an established power, strong enough that it wouldn't need a sponsor and instead would have an extensive ally network. The world would be a three-way power struggle between Americans, Russians, and Chinese. An important question
this would be a better world.
answer for is, would there be a major war as America and Russia would have to adapt to China rising as a great power, possibly more powerful than either of them? And I don't know, partially because this alternate history has been so long already, and there are so many confounding variables, but also we don't know how the world will react to the rise of China in our world, let alone this alternate history. What if Altist, and thank you for watching. If you enjoyed that video, please comment, subscribe, like, or tell a friend. Also, if you want to see more of my maps never before seen in What If Altist, head on to my Patreon, the link to which is in the description. The first chapter of my history of the world will be coming out on Patreon.
That was a great video. I very much enjoyed it. If you liked that video, go subscribe, go like, go join his Patreon, everything else like that. He deserves all the love. I love the amount of work he puts into this. I would never be able to convince myself to actually do this, but I very much appreciate those who actually dedicate themselves to actually trying to make alternate history. I would love to, but I'm a lazy asshole. So go subscribe to him and everything else like that. If you liked my rambles, let's be real, that's what they were. If you liked my rambles, I guess subscribe to me, I guess like the video. Leave comments down below of what you think my particular political spectrum is. I might tell you, I might not. I don't know if I've already said it before, but whatever, it doesn't matter. My cat's meowing in the background. And I believe the edibles are kicking in. Alright, cool. You guys have a great day. I will probably record another video tomorrow since I'm in fucking quarantine, so I might as well. So I'll see y'all tomorrow. Goodbye. Farewell. Try not to get laid off, and if you do, drink some Coronas.